Hello, this is Sociology 103, Introduction to Sociology. This video lecture will cover Chapter 1, Sociological Perspectives and Research, Part 1. So what is sociology? Sociology is the study of human behavior in society. So while in psychology we look at the individual, in sociology we look at the group. It is a scientific way of thinking about society and its influence on human groups. All human behavior occurs within a context or circumstance. Context can be defined as the institutions and cultures that surround us, how they shape what we do, and how we think. So in a sense, your context is your family life, it's your school you attend, it's the church or mosque you attend, it's where you work. All of these institutions shape who you become. Context is studied to show how society shapes our lives. Then we have the sociological perspective. This is the ability to see the patterns in society that influence individual group life. So we're looking for patterns, and that's what sociologists do. The task of sociology is to understand the relationship between individuals and the society in which they live. And what we need to do is we need to focus in on two very specific ideas. There is a distinction between what is called troubles, meaning privately felt problems from an individual's life. For example, finding out that one of your kids is a drug addict, losing your job, being in a car accident, something that affects you personally, versus something called issues. And issues are something that we're going to be talking about a lot in this class. Issues are problems that affect a large number of people, and as such become a problem for society. So for example, high unemployment, racism, immigration, all of those things that affect a vast majority of people in this country. Now, to keep in mind that sociology is a social science, which means that we follow the empirical approach, which requires that conclusions are based on systematic observations and not just on assumptions. We're not guessing. We create a hypothesis and then we test it. And this is called the scientific method. So the scientific method is a logical and rational order of steps by which scientists come to conclusions about the world around them. The scientific method helps to organize thoughts and procedures so that scientists can be confident in the answers they find. Finally, scientists use observations, hypotheses, and deductions to make these conclusions. And sometimes the research reveals very inconvenient facts because they're unsettling, because it exposes problems that are deeply embedded in society. So facts we learn through research can challenge the way we think. So for example, a lot of us might feel that Asians tend to be very wealthy, but in fact poverty among Asian Americans is higher than among white Americans. Women with a college degree earn less than men with only some college experience. The number of women prisoners has increased at twice the rate of men. Prisoners suffer from mental disorders at a much higher rate than the general population, and these mental disorders predate incarceration. So, in a sense, we're asking what comes first, the mental disorder or the crime. So if you have people who have mood disorders or personality disorders or psychosis of any kind and they act out, they end up in jail. So we see a lot of people in jail with mental disorders. This last bullet is one of my personal favorites, and this is the percentage of votes for Republican and Democratic candidates in 2010 and 2012 races for the U.S. House of Representatives could be predicted by the percentage of tweets that mention those candidates on Twitter. So, for example, if we were looking at a political candidate, the more people tweet about him or her, the more likely they are to win, which really goes into some great detail about how social media can be used to predict elections. There's also in sociology something we call debunking. And this is when we question actions and ideas that are usually taken for granted. And we often find these commonly held beliefs are wrong. So, for example, I'm looking at schooling. What is the primary purpose of school? Education will allow people to get ahead in life. Well, the underlying context is that social relationships are formed, changed, and broken. What you're really learning in school is how to interact with other people. Additionally, expectations are learned. Socioeconomic issues are reflected in middle-class schools versus urban schools. In a middle-class school, you're going to have a lot more resources to work with, whereas in a low-income urban school, they have minimal resources to work with. And that reflects in the education that can be provided to these students. Additionally, gender differences are emphasized in the ways boys and girls are treated by teachers. We know, based on sociological studies, that teachers tend to pay more attention to boys. We also know that teachers tend to perceive middle-class kids as being smarter than low-income kids. Rather than supporting a child's desire to get ahead in life, often school is a way kids are stifled in their opportunities. So this is debunking the whole concept of why we go to school. Another important element to understand is this concept called social structure. The organized pattern of social relationships and social institutions that together constitute society. So you have your social relationships of people interacting, and then there's also social institutions like work, church, school. And these interactions constitute what we understand as society. Social structure also refers to the fact that social forces guide and shape human behavior. So our choices are often due to our position in society. Social institutions, as I mentioned, are established and organized systems of social behavior with a particular and recognized purpose. So, for example, family, big one. Your family is the most significant social institution that you will experience in your lifetime. Religion, marriage, government, and the economy all fit within this definition of a social institution. The other thing we look at is social change. And social change is the alteration of society over time. Sociologists view society as stable, but it is constantly changing over time. So this is actually a picture of Philadelphia back in the 1700s when we had the Constitutional Congress. And then this is the same building from a different perspective today. You'll notice that the building itself has not changed, but the surroundings have absolutely changed. A dirt road, carriages and horses, and of course nowadays we have tar roads and cars and buses and duck vehicles and all that other good stuff. But society changes slowly over time, so we don't really watch it like we're watching a movie. It's just occurring. Social interaction is behavior between two or more people that is given some sort of meaning. So through social interaction, people react and change depending on the actions and reactions of others. So if you see this picture over here, these two little girls are having a conversation. And what they do is they look back and they give her a look, which means, to many of us, that they are gossiping about her. Now, the reality is they might just be sharing a joke and they notice that someone is watching them. But we put meaning on the actions of others. And that becomes a huge element in understanding society because we're interpreting social interaction 24 hours a day. Another element to understand is diversity. And diversity is the difference between groups, especially in the treatment of these different groups. Examples of diversity can include, but are not limited to, race, socioeconomic class, gender, age, nationality, sexual orientation, and the region of residence. In the United States, somebody from the North may look at somebody from the South as not being as intelligent because they speak with an accent. If you go out to California, people tend to talk much slower and have a much different perspective. If you go to Kansas, which is in the middle of the country, people are going to be a lot different than the people are on the East Coast. So even where we live creates diversity. We have this thing called an organic metaphor. And early sociologists in Europe and the United States conceived of society as an organism, a system of interrelated functions and parts that work together to create the whole. So in a sense, think of a human being. And you'll see that I have pictures over here. The earth as a woman laying on her back. Here's a man as the earth with the trees growing out of his skull. And this is how sociologists saw the earth, as a living organism that changes and evolves, just like humans do, just like any living organism does, from a cell to an animal to a human to a tree. So now we're going to look at 3 sociological frameworks, and the best way to define these frameworks is to explain how they see society. So the 3 sociological frameworks we're looking at are functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. So the first question is, what is the relationship of individuals to society? In a functionalist perspective, they believe that individuals occupy fixed social roles. In conflict theory, individuals are subordinated to society. So whatever society demands of us is what role we fill. And then we have symbolic interaction. And this is when the individual and society are interdependent, meaning that the individual affects their role in society, and society affects their role as an individual. So another question to kind of emphasize the meanings behind these 3 sociological frameworks. Why is there inequality? Well, in a functionalist perspective, they believe that inequality is inevitable. It helps society survive. It helps move forward. So, slavery exists so that, a certain portion of the population can get things done. The lower working class exists so that the higher classes don't have to get their hands dirty. In conflict theory, they believe that inequality is the result of a struggle over scarce resources. So if there are, 8 pieces of pizza and 9 people, you have to engage in some level of conflict in order to get a piece of pizza. In symbolic interactionism, Inequality is demonstrated through the meaning of status symbols. So, driving a BMW versus driving a 1979 Oldsmobile clearly defines inequality. And so what I want you to be thinking about in these frameworks is that there are schools of professors and researchers who come from these perspectives. How is social order possible? Functionalism believes that social order stems from a consensus on public values. So, for example, our social order for democracy in the United States was based on a consensus of all Americans wanting to be independent from Great Britain. Conflict theory, on the other hand, would say, no, it's maintained through power and coercion. So our founding fathers, John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, they were the ones who had the power, and they coerced the population into believing that independence was the most vital aspect of being an American. And then we have symbolic interactionism, which believes that social order is sustained through social interaction and adherence to social norms. And we'll talk more about social norms. But what this is saying is more like social order is a matter of convincing people, getting them on your side, convincing them that it's a good idea, and not coercion. What is the source of social change? Functionalism believes that society seeks equilibrium when there is social disorganization. So back in the 60s, when the hippies were protesting the war and they were protesting any number of things, society itself was willing to change a little bit so that we would have equilibrium or balance. Conflict theory believes that change comes through the mobilization of people struggling for resources. So let's go back to the 60s when the hippies were protesting the war. One of the big elements and issues was that at 18 you could get drafted to go fight in the military, but the voting age at the time was 21. So change came because young people were refusing to fight in a war that they did not have a say about vis-a-vis voting. Then we have symbolic interactionism. Change derives from evolving social relationships and the creation of new meaning systems. In this context, look at gay marriage. 10, 20 years ago, gay marriage was not even on the radar. And nowadays, you can't swing a cat without hitting a couple that are gay and who are planning to get married. The idea here is that society has evolved and understands that being gay is not a choice, it is something you're born with, and that Americans of whatever sexual orientation deserve to be treated in the same way. So what are the criticisms? So the major criticism of functionalism is that conservative views of society ignore or minimize power differences among and between groups. So they're not looking at the fact that the upper classes, the wealthy, have the ability to control the incomes of the lower income people. Conflict theory underestimates the degree of cohesion and stability in society. So conflict theory believes that there's always conflict going around. However, and this is the important thing, the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of stability in our society. Finally, with symbolic interactionism, we see that research methods are often unscientific and are based on the interpretation of meaning of behavior or language. So it is not as easy to measure the hypotheses, test it, check the results, have a scientific method, and look at the results in a scientific way. So a lot of symbolic interactionists are seen more as impressionistic rather than scientific. So we're going to finish out this section of the PowerPoint talking about a concept called globalization. And this is the prevalence of global politics and communication. Diversity is a worldwide phenomenon. The international connections transcend barriers and create bridges of interaction. Today you can get on an airplane and in 12 hours be in China. You can get on an airplane and in 6 hours be in England or France. We can travel around the world in a matter of 2 or 3 days. We can email people in other countries and interact with them in a completely non-time-based situation. I can email my family in Ireland and they can respond within a minute. In the old days, if I sent a letter, it would be a week to get to Ireland and then another week to get a response. Now it's immediate. So we live in a global world where everything is at our fingertips. I buy a particular kind of pen from Japan because I can. Globalization brings diverse cultures together, but it is also a process by which Western markets have penetrated much of the world. And we're going to talk about how a lot of people don't like Americans because they see our way of doing things, like McDonald's and Starbucks and Microsoft and Apple, as being focused on stuff that's not that important, that's not spiritual or vital to our survival. And these are folks who are living in essentially third world communities. The other thing we're eventually going to look at is cultural practices. And this is the traditional and customary practices of a particular ethnic or other cultural group. In this country now, getting tattoos is almost a rite of passage, whereas in other countries, they use facial scarring, where they actually make cuts into the face. They utilize different methodologies to identify couples and marriages. They open up holes in noses. They use neck extenders and elongators. So, there's a lot of cultural practices that might seem bizarre to outsiders, but are taken for granted or defined as appropriate by the people who live in their community. Finally, I want to talk about stereotypes. A stereotype is a rigid, oversimplified, often exaggerated belief that is applied both to an entire social category of people and to each individual within it. Stereotypes form the basis for prejudice, which in turn is used to justify discrimination and attitudes. So I have a little meme here that I'm sure some of you might have seen, and it's used in a variety of ways. There's probably thousands of these out there, but this one is in regard specifically to college students. So what my friends think I do, what my mom thinks I do, what society thinks I do, you party animals, what the government thinks I do, what you think you do, which is really, you're imagining yourself in the library with a pile of books studying hard, and the fact of the matter is you probably have your phone open checking Twitter or Facebook. So, and it's a stereotype. It's not meant to be true. Now let's look at some other stereotypes. So researchers have done some amazing studies about the media and stereotypes we see. So if you look at an African American, usually on TV or movies, they're athletes or gang members or police officers. Arab Americans almost always are terrorists or convenience store clerks. Asian Americans tend to be physicians, lawyers, CEOs, or factory workers. Hispanic Americans are gang members and factory workers. You very rarely see a CEO who is a Hispanic American on TV. Irish Americans are drunks, police officers, and factory workers. Italian Americans got to be the crime boss, Tony Soprano. gang members, restaurant workers, and then finally, Jewish Americans tend to be seen as physicians, lawyers, CEOs, and teachers. Now, we're going to be talking about stereotypes a lot in this class, but I want you to start paying attention to the TV shows you're watching and look to see and examine exactly what it is about these folks that, represent particular stereotypes. So that's it for this video lecture. If you have any questions, please email or text me, and I hope you have a great day.